Hello, hello. Thank you everybody for being here today. Today we're lucky enough to get to speak with Daren Hatfield, author of Nothing Ever Happens on Main Street. And I just want to say, for a story about time travel, this was done in such a unique way, at least for myself, where it felt incredibly accessible the entire time. It felt so easy to get lost in. And at the same time, you're touching on heavy topics, but you're keeping this wave of innocence and youthfulness throughout the whole story, which for me really set it apart from other time travel novels. Like honestly, hats off to you. It felt like we were rooting for the main characters from the get-go. And even when you have kind of the craziness going on, you're still being like, I don't know, he might be onto something here. And I think that that's just it was a really nice part of the story as well.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And, I wasn't sure if the people thought the time travel was unique enough or if it was just a tired trope, but I enjoyed doing it.
I think that's where I'd like to start because I had a lot of strong feelings about this book, all positive. I really, really loved it. It was a great story. And all the way through it, I was thinking about different types of time travel that because we featured quite a few stories with time travel. And I think pretty much every time we featured it, it's been done a little bit differently. So tell me about did the story start with the idea of time travel as part of it, or was it more like a mechanic that you put in there to tell the story that you wanted to tell? Like where did it all come from?
It didn't really start with time travel. I, I I was actually it was probably an idea that came up around 7 years ago, and I happened to be in a Main Street setting, uh, and there were fireworks going off, and everybody was looking at the fireworks, but I was just sort of looking at the street and the architecture, and I was just admiring the beauty of the town, and I could see all the shadows and the lights of the fireworks reflecting on the old brownstone buildings, and I thought, oh, this would be an interesting setting for a sci-fi type story. And then I started to think about, well, Main Streets typically tend to be sleepy, just old, and nothing really happens there. And so my next question was, why doesn't anything happen on Main Street? And then all of a sudden, that's when time travel kicked in. It's like something stopping it from happening. So it wasn't necessarily going to be about time travel necessarily. I just wanted to create a sci-fi type environment within the town because I felt it was kind of an overlooked era for that kind of story.
Which honestly, now that I think about it, makes a ton of sense. Like why I'm a very literal reader, and a lot of tropes go over my head as I've quickly learned over the years. So that's I'm gonna process that because that's a really really cool thing that I'm piecing together now. But it makes total sense.
Well, that was the initial concept was what really drew me to it. If you could do it, if you can go back in time and change things, well, why would you ever let anything bad happen? Which leads into the kind of themes of the story, I guess. So tell me a little bit about how you came up. How did you come up with the story itself? Did you start with the kind of that inspiration on Main Street and then build it all from there? Was it more discovery writing kind of thing? Like, what's your kind of process for starting and finishing these things?
Sometimes when you get the germ of an idea, whether you like it or not, the story starts making itself. And like I said, it was maybe about 7, 8 years ago, and I just sort of set it aside because it was more or less just an adventure story, and it didn't resonate with me. I didn't understand the characters. It was just some exciting concepts. But it was last year when I really started to realize there is something about the characters that I could relate to, which was the idea of this person has a responsibility. He feels he has a responsibility to take care of the people, and that kind of burden it puts on him. So as I put that together and put that in the story, then it's like, what kind of things have to happen to convey that story? And then also taking the main character, the boy Parker, what's he experiencing? Then I put a little bit of myself into each character, and that ended up telling the story itself.
Do you always put a little bit of yourself into characters?
Not always, but this
Mhm.
one was particularly, it went from being just a simple third person adventure story to something that was very personal to me at the time. There were some of the things that I was dealing with. And
Mhm.
it was just exciting to be writing it. Most of the time, the things I write on are just pure fun adventure. And it could be, I just want to write about an interesting character because I'm one of the least interesting people. So I wouldn't write about myself.
Well, I think
That
that's
tends to be the
part of
case with writers.
I think that's part of what makes the setting, at least for me, so intriguing is that you're taking place and you have the one of my favorite parts about a book, for better or for worse, is the little map you got in it.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
and because I originally read this, I believe on Kindle, and there was no the map didn't pop up, or you can't really go back and forth on a Kindle like you can
not easily. No.
in a book. Um, and something like that just really helps kind of set the scene. And when you think about time travel, most of us think about sci-fi, the future, this and that. But thinking about it back in the 1910s, back in the main street of a sleepy town, it is really interesting because you have a hustle and bustle going around everywhere. But at the end of the day, you're just focused on yourself. And the story starts with Parker being like, "Oh, it's gonna be another boring summer and this and that." Like, I didn't grow up in a small town by any means, but I didn't grow up in a city. And I remember as a kid, like you go into the summer, it's like, okay, we're gonna do the same things we do every summer, but because it's fun and it's great. So it's nice to see kind of a different take on that and see the adventures that can be had. Like it felt to an extent, I felt what's the word I'm looking for? A little bit of Stand By Me in terms of like the two
Yeah.
Mhm.
the two kids kind of going and like having to grow up real fast. And then forgive me,
Mhm.
I'm blanking on the names here. You had Cora Cassandra.
Cora. Yeah.
Um I forget. Can you remind me, please? Cora was the daughter.
Cora was the mother and
Cora was
Cassandra
the
was the
mother,
daughter.
Cassandra was the
Yeah.
daughter. My bad. I had a 50-50 there.
No,
But it felt like one of those things where age wasn't a factor. They might have been kids, but they weren't like, yeah, you had the moments with the sweets and this and that, but they had their own personalities outside of just being children, and they had to grow up real fast. And then I think this gets back into the burden you were talking about. Just that's a
right.
lot to place on Parker at a young age. It's a lot to place on anybody at any age. And you've seen it drive Doyle absolutely insane over the years because how many times, like, I guess for lack of a better word, when something finally does go wrong and you know you tried to fix it 800 times through and it just didn't work, I'd go insane as well. It felt relatable
Right.
in that context.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was really much about um like when you look at the character arcs, I always felt Cassandra was the one who sort of got left behind.
Mhm.
And I mean, because she was dealing with things, but because I had to tell it from Parker's perspective because I didn't want that omniscient narrator to come in and have to wrestle with some of the details. I wanted everything to be captured through Parker's lens, but he couldn't understand necessarily what was going through Cassandra's mind.
Mhm.
Um, and I always felt I had to keep that out of the story, and I felt I didn't do her justice in terms of a character because you knew she was dealing with the loss of her father. But I always felt like maybe I just didn't give her enough story time. But
I
I felt it was necessary.
like I see where you're coming from, but I feel personally when you're talking about two kids dealing with those kind of heavier topics, even two adults dealing with those heavier topics, it isn't easy. I think if as you've written it from Parker's perspective, like yeah, what is like a middle schooler gonna do, you know? Like I think
Yeah,
they went about it in like that innocent way of, oh, I don't know. Because I think that that's what's real. If Parker came at it from a therapist perspective in the 1910s, it'd
Mhm.
be like then time travel would really like
right.
If
Yeah,
anything, I thought that played to its advantage because the heavier things that Cora was dealing with were seen through the lens of someone who's not really so much had to deal with them, and it's left then to like I'm an adult, I've had to go through things in my life. Seeing it from a child's perspective, I thought made it much more relatable, if anything, because then it was implied what it was going through. So like maybe Parker doesn't understand what's happening, but the reader does. It
right.
was actually one of the things that I'd noted down to say was that deliberate, was to keep it to that specific point of view, like to keep the reader kind of constrained within the POV that we had. Because I thought that worked really well for it. I wanted to ask about POV actually, but was that deliberate?
Yeah, it was deliberate. And
Mhm.
like I said, we put a little bit of yourself into each of the characters, and I
Yeah.
felt, in order for me to help address some of the issues that were going on, I
Mhm.
could sort of step into Parker's innocence and
Yeah, yeah.
process them in a real way. Um, so
How
that
did you
was
go about
deliberate.
getting into that headspace with it? Like to because I've never written from a child's POV before. It's just never occurred to me to because I think, well, I'm not a child. I have no idea how to write from that perspective. Forgetting that I used to be a child, obviously. That I was that I was born at a very young age. But how did you go about getting into that kind of mindset for it from like as a writer?
There's a few things. One of it helps is you don't really quite grow up yourself, and the other one is I actually when I wrote it, I was like I wanted to write a story that I might enjoy reading, both as an adult, but something I would have enjoyed reading, when I was a young adult. And
Mhm.
but also, so I would go back and I would read books that I enjoyed at that age, and sort of it put me back into when I was in that grade or when I was 10 years old or 12 years old.
Mhm.
And and it helps because I have a daughter who's also around that age. And so
Mhm.
I'm seeing what she's going through and some of the challenges and how she's addressing it. She does it much better than I did at her age. But so it kind of helps. But at the same time, I didn't want to treat Parker as just a helpless boy. You know,
Mhm.
I I think there are levels of maturity that maybe you don't necessarily see, or at least some
Mhm.
self-awareness that you don't usually see in a 12-year-old. And maybe that helped a little bit because I didn't want to keep him at that level. I wanted to. It also helped because I went back and wrote the forward um,
Mhm.
to explain that hey, this is sort of a memoir, and
Uh-huh.
I
that
like
helped
that.
me. Yeah, it helped me look at it from a. He's allowed to interject maybe some thoughts he had later on in his life. And so
Uh-huh.
I didn't feel like I was stuck into just a 12-year-old or 13-year-old boy. It's a grown adult looking back and maybe
Yeah.
color a little bit with his maturity.
I'm glad you touched on that because I noted that down as well to ask, was that deliberate? Did you use that framing device to free yourself up a little bit to express the kind of lessons learned from things, in retrospect, things that you can look back upon? Because it was, I think, one of the highest compliments I can give a book is that it sent me to my own notes to type down some ideas that I was having. I was like, God, that's really cool. I should have, I wish I'd thought of that. That's a really great idea. Like, so like,
Yeah.
did you take in inspiration from anywhere specifically? Are you like a big uh, time travel kind of fiction reader? Because I got like kind of Jules Verne vibes at some point through it. I wanted to ask.
Yeah, you could it was I would say there was some Jules Verne sort of inspiration
A little,
behind it.
little bit of Dickens maybe I was getting at times as well.
Yeah, a little bit. I purposely wanted to push it back, one, because I find that the time period
Hmm.
fascinating. Um,
Yeah.
I think it's a very colorful time period. Also, that particular time, there wasn't a lot of like major world events that were taking place
Hmm.
that, because somebody would ask if you've got the power to change time, would you go back and, you know,
Hmm.
you know, change this, prevent this tragedy from happening, like,
Uh-huh.
whether like the assassination of Lincoln or something like that, so
Yeah,
I tried
yeah.
to find an area where you could just sort of focus on yourself, and that
That's a
time
good
period worked really
point.
well. But also, I wanted to limit it. I didn't want technology to intrude too much. I wanted to be about the people. I wanted to be about the relationships. And, so you didn't have people who were constantly looking at their phones or consuming media like we do today. I just wanted to be very simplified, and also
Hmm.
that actually limited the ability of time travel. So you can never travel forward in time with based on this the concepts that were in the book. So
Hmm.
that made sure that it didn't get out of hand. So the time you're always sort of stuck in the time period that you were in.
Hmm. It
Interesting.
was one of the things I wanted to ask as well was what your favorite kind of, or what your favorite time travel story is, film, TV, books, whatever. because I'm a real sucker for a good time travel story. Also, a time loop, which there was a lot of elements of here, where repeating the same thing over and over again, trying to do things. I love that kind of Groundhog Day thing going on, especially when it's
Right.
voluntary. Uh, what about your what about you? What about your favorites? If you've got any.
Um, I don't know if I have any favorites. I'm always really attracted to it. It's
Mhm.
not really time travel, uh, but it is sort of time manipulation, which there was a book written by John D. MacDonald called uh, The Girl, the Gold Watch, and Everything. And it
Mhm.
was about a gentleman who inherits a pocket watch that could freeze time. And so the things that he could do if he could just pause time and manipulate the world around him, that was an enjoyable read, and it had an impact on me.
Mhm. That reminds me of Bernard's Watch, which I don't think either of you guys will know because that was a UK thing, which was a show about a young boy who had a watch that could stop time. Which, if you think about it, is the most ridiculously overpowered thing that you could give to a 10-year-old
Right.
boy. And he used it to do lovely things like paint the whole house while his mum was out shopping and decorate for her and do all the housework and things and do all of his homework on time. And me and my friends used to watch it and go, no, you would do way worse things than that. You would do terrible things if you could stop time. You would,
Well,
I
I
think the
think
worst it ever done was drop a bucket of water on someone or something. I was like, no, come on, man, you could do better than that.
I think that's the thing, and that's what makes the story so nice with
Mhm.
Parker is that there is that level of innocence and there is that level of just like general wholesomeness where yeah, you have
Mhm.
frankly all the power in the world, but you're not being nefarious with it. And you have a moral compass that not everyone could mimic, you know? Um, and I think that in itself is very powerful because you have the scenes where you kind of have people trying to copy and this and that, and then it gets to the crux of the story. But there is elements of just enjoying going back to the lack of media and this and that, like enjoying your
Mhm.
smaller community and like your life rather than getting so sucked into the power and the greed and all that comes along with it too.
Yeah. Yeah. Ultimately, the story is one about um, empathy, and thinking about what's going on with the people around you. And
Mhm.
I hadn't, it was, it was only by pure coincidence. I mean, subtly, I think subconsciously, it entered in the story where you're talking with the banker, and he had no empathy whatsoever. He didn't recognize people's names. He was completely oblivious to the needs of the people around him. Um, and so that would just made that contrast between here's some people who are on a journey or living a life that's all about making sure you're taking care of other people, and then you have the villains who were only thinking about themselves.
Mhm.
And so it's very much about the relationships and understanding, looking outside yourself at the other people.
One of the talking of like what the story's about at its core, I think empathy is a great one, obviously, and the author would know better than anyone else. What I'd written down in my notes while I was reading was, who are we if the terrible things that happen to us never happen to us?
Mm,
Which I thought was one of those like big kind of central thematic things. Like if nothing bad ever happened, you never learn from there's it's
Yeah.
right.
almost it kind of felt like it was almost about grief in a way where it was like things that you wish never happened, you can just make it they never happened, but then you have to live in the world that you've created, which might not be any better. Bad things
Right.
happen all the time. Was that part of it when you went into it, or was it more from the empathy perspective as well?
No, that's very much a part of it, and that's why I had,
Mm-hmm.
if as far as the character arcs, they're all dealing with something, except for
Mm-hmm.
Cora, the
Yeah.
female protagonist. She dealt with her big event, which was the loss of her husband. But
Mm-hmm.
she had completed that arc, and she was in a much better place where she could help the people around her. And so that was she's very much a product of her circumstances, what happened to her. She couldn't change it, but she built on it, and she was able to actually be the support for the other characters in the book.
And
So it's very much about how you let your situations define you.
And it's really, really interesting to get into that because obviously, like you said, Cora didn't have a rewind button. So what happened happened and she had to deal with it. But Doyle has always had the rewind button. And then you see
Yeah.
them and you see their two different perspectives. And obviously Cora comes into the picture and she is so put together and so on top of what's going on. And it makes total sense because she never had that crutch to rely on. She just had to, for better or for worse, she just had to kind of suck it up and continue on.
Just had to get over things, man.
Just had to
Just
get
had to get
over it.
over it.
Yeah.
But then
Yeah.
that gets into um and I don't know how canon this is. I apologize. And spoilers. Yeah, yeah. You're 20, 30 minutes into the interview at this point. If you haven't read the book, go back and read the book. But when the note you included with the story about if I recall correctly was about it wasn't Doyle, it was the guy before Doyle trying to stop the train crash. Is there more to that?
Yes.
Okay.
I originally had written Nothing Ever Happens in Main Street as my plan was it's a standalone novel. I wanted to be one and done.
Mhm.
But as I started to wrap it up, I realized, wait a minute, there's more going on here.
Mhm.
There's obviously a history with Von Pillier, the inventor of the device. There seems to be this connection with Wishrath because he had plans to build his own device. And so I realized, wait a minute, there's something that happened here. And as I started to think about that, I was like, there's a whole nother story about Von Pillier that I can tell.
Mhm.
And so that's slowly starting to bubble to the surface.
Oh, yes, that's exciting.
So
I love the way you describe it bubbling to the surface because one writer to another, I find that stories don't appear, they don't descend into my head kind of already preformed.
mhm.
They start bubbling up like from the swamp of the mind, and you get little ideas here, little ideas there, a scene here, a character here, little motifs, whatever, moments and stuff. Is that how you've always found it? It literally is like kind of coming up and you need to just let it rise, or do you ever try and make that happen?
Yeah, it's
Mhm.
interesting. It's exactly you can't stop it, and
Yeah.
it's to follow that metaphor. It's a if you think of raising a ship from the bottom of the ocean, there's going to be different parts
Yeah.
that appear different times. Here's the mast, here's the stern, and
Mhm.
slowly the picture comes up, and then you see them all connect, and you're like, hey, I've got a whole object here, and that's what I'm
Yeah.
experiencing
Yeah.
right now. Is like, well, I know this happens, and I know this happens, but I'm waiting to see how do the two connect, and that's where I'm
Yeah.
at.
Yeah, it's really heartening to hear another author say that because that's exactly how it feels when it happens to me. I usually have like snippets of about 4 or 5 stories, and then they end up becoming one thing.
Yeah.
When you find the connective tissue between the elements that you're coming up with, I guess. Refloating it, like raising a ship from the deep. That's a fantastic metaphor. I'm going to steal that if you don't mind.
Dig it.
As
Yeah, it's you look around in the writing community and you see this conversation going on, or like, are you a plotter or are you a pantser? It
Yeah.
seems to be a popular question. And the human mind is so amazing. It's like some of that is like 10 steps ahead of us. And it already knows what the story is almost. And you think that you're just pantsing, you're just writing as you go, but your brain has already
Mhm.
figured out the story and you're just uncovering it.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's uh, That's very on point, man. I mean, we had an author last month who talked to us about discovery writing for a while, and it's something I try and wait until there's enough meat there that I can or enough of a skeleton rather that I can kind of put the meat around it. But there's something to be said for just starting the progress or starting the process and letting the brain just percolate on things as they come.
Yeah.
That's as someone who's not a writer. My only experience with writing has just been in academia, so it's always been plotted. But it is really cool to kind of because at this point we've worked with an abundance of authors and just to see how everyone has a different journey along it. There's no two plotters that are the same. There's no two pantsers that are the same. And ultimately, it always ends up in a really cool story. But like you said, your
Mhm.
brain knows. Your brain is doing its thing 10 steps ahead of you.
Right.
Whether or not you allow it to, whether or not you match it. But it is crazy to see that you can come up with incredible, especially something like time travel. Like if you're pantsing a time travel story, that's insane. Like
Yeah. Yeah. I couldn't do that. In fact, that was probably one of the most challenging things that I ever attempted to do because you had to think backwards
Mhm.
constantly.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I was like, well, he's got to do this, but I want this and this. And it was like, I had to write it and then rewrite it and constantly, it's
Yeah.
like, think the whole thing through and
Mhm.
then turn it around and look at it from the other perspective. Well, if it's going backwards, how's this going to happen? And so you can't you just can't wing that.
And it's even and like from my perspective, I'm this visualizing a whiteboard with red streaking everywhere. It's basically a crime scene.
Yeah.
But when you're
Yeah.
reading through and they're rewinding time, it is a rewind. People start walking backwards, things slow down.
Mhm.
And just visually, that's a really interesting concept to visualize. Um, and I know I find it weird when like you'll see it on media today, you can just push a rewind button, things will go backwards. But
Yeah.
back then, from the perspective of a kid in the 1910s, and you're seeing everything going backwards, it's trippy now. That's got to be a lot weirder back then.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like
Interesting.
you use the term rewind, and I had to stop myself from using that
Oh,
term
my bad.
because I mean, no, it's I was in the same place because I realized they didn't have devices that they didn't have
Yeah.
cassette tapes or anything that they would
Uh-huh.
rewind.
Wasn't just going like, but
Yeah. So I was like, well, how would they describe that? And I was like, well,
yeah.
if it's a clock, they wind a clock, maybe they could unwind a clock. So I had to change from
Mhm.
rewind to
Mm.
unwind. It's just little things like that. You had to put
How
yourself in
much?
the vernacular of the time.
How much research went into the vernacular of the time? Because it
I
did
want to ask
feel,
that as well. Yeah.
yeah, it did feel like you were immersed, like fully immersed in the setting.
Actually, one of the things that I did was I spent a lot of time. I would go back and I'd read books that were written around that time, like Tom Swift,
Mm.
Yeah, yeah.
which it sort of get an idea of what life was like for people living that time, even though there was a sci-fi spin to it. But I knew that they were kind of products of their time, so
Mm.
you could
Mhm.
at least get an idea of how they spoke. But then I would go back and I this was really fun was finding newspapers from the era online and read articles and what they were writing about in the newspaper, what's going on in these. I would just find small town newspapers and just
Mhm.
see what were the events that were going on, and then how they would describe them, and then those became pastiches of
That's really
Harding
cool.
Springs, and
We,
it was that was how I was able to keep one foot in that era, but at the same time, I didn't want to dive in too much. I wanted to be a little more accessible for somebody reading it today.
no, that's
Mhm.
really cool because I haven't done it in years, but I remember when I was in college, we would go to the public library and you'd go and they'd have a section of old stories or old newspapers and this and that, and you'd have your little weird computer thing. You'd go through and you'd zoom in on every little section. You could see what an
Mhm.
ad in the 1910s looked like. You could see what a catastrophe, like what like if the building burned down, how would they report on it back then? If they found a body, how would they report on it back
Yeah,
then? And that's a really, really good use
yeah,
of material. That's
yeah.
really
In fact, the
Mhm.
the incident where I described what happened to Cassandra's father,
Mhm.
that was based on an actual event that I read in a paper, and it was like, what a tragedy, where a train just ran into the back end of another train, and and that seemed like not to minimize it or
Mhm.
dehumanize it, but it seemed like an appropriate way of capturing Cassandra's tragedy.
well, I think again,
Mhm.
if we're getting lost in an era and we're completely immersing ourselves into an era, it makes complete sense to go about it in the same way they would have. And if they diminished it back then, unfortunately, if you want to stay accurate, that's kind of not to say they did or they didn't, but you kind of have to put yourself in that headspace. I mean, we
Yeah.
saw it a little bit with way back when, I know we're running out of time here, but way back when we had an author, Will Tinkham, who wrote a story called The Teddy and Bear Show, which took place after a mining disaster in the early
Hmm.
1900s, late 1800s. And it was really interesting to see how that was reported on as well.
Yeah.
But on that note, we have 3 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we kind of cover all of our bases here. If if subscribers liked reading Nothing Ever Happens on Main Street, what's the best way they can get a hold of you? What do you suggest they read next? Where do we go from here?
Um, the best way to sort of keep track of, I'm mostly active on X.
Mhm.
Hmm.
So Hatfield tweet is my ID. But you can also go to DarenHatfield.com, and I'm hopefully going to have a YouTube channel up soon,
Nice.
maybe coming next
Nice.
week. There's been some complications. I won't go into them here, but
Hmm.
that prevented it from happening. So now I can finally do it. And but if you go to DarenHatfield.com, it'll have all the links except the YouTube one, which isn't live yet, to
Mhm.
my social
Hmm.
media, so they can keep track of what's going on. But again, the I'm most prominent on X. I don't know why, it just happened that way, and so they can always keep track of where I'm at and what's coming up next.
Wonderful.
Now, as
Nice.
far as book recommendations, that's a tough one. I
Hmm.
the book recommend, if they like Nothing Ever Happens on Main Street, um, keep your ears to the rails, because there is going to be some more of that. Hopefully early next year.
Oh, it's very exciting.
And
It's
am I right in thinking that that's going to be no spoilers now, but is that going to be the story that you were telling us a bit earlier about the kind of the genesis of the machines and everything that they're using?
Yeah, yeah,
nice.
exactly.
Nice.
That'd be cool, man.
Like a prequel. That's very exciting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Likewise. Well,
Well,
we
we'll be sure to feature it on Extra Extra, right, Ryan? When
Yeah,
we
yeah.
when it comes out.
So that's actually a good way to go about it. So basically, every month we shoot, I didn't set a timer. Every every month we do an extra where an author we feature in the past, we put on a little sheet, we show the new story that they've come out with, and we share it with our
Mm,
subscribers just as a, hey guys, here's something that we featured before, here's someone we featured before. They've written, like, we love their story for this reason. They've just come out with
mm.
this. We highly recommend checking it out. So once your latest story comes out, we will certainly be doing that. It's very exciting.
Okay. Now, unfortunately, the idea for the prequel um,
I
came while I was
I
already in the midst of
Oh
another one.
No,
no.
I hate to interrupt you. I hate to interrupt you. We got like
Yeah,
15 seconds left.
got
But
it.
thank you so
Oh
much for
no.
being here, guys. If you made it the whole interview, it's Nothing Ever Happens on Main Street. I had a wonderful time.
Thanks for coming to the
Again.
pub.